Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's discussion, the latest in our Climate for Business series. I'm Nat Keohane, and I'm the president here at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, or C2ES. Our guest today is Jennifer Granholm, the 16th Secretary of Energy and just the second woman to lead the U.S. Department of Energy. We're really pleased to have Secretary Granholm with us today to talk about the net zero transition, the role that the Biden administration and the Department of Energy will play in it, and how accelerating the low carbon economy can make American companies and workers more competitive. I have a number of questions that I'll be asking her, and we have a couple that we've also gleaned from the audience as you registered. So we'll have plenty of program available. Unfortunately, we won't be able to take questions from the audience in real time, so I invite you to listen and learn as we go forward. If you miss anything, we will be recording today's conversation, and we'll be putting that recording up on the C2ES webpage within the next 24 hours. Before we get started, let me just provide a little bit of introduction to C2ES and some context for the conversation. So at C2ES, our mission is to accelerate the transition to a thriving, just, and resilient net zero economy. We work to build support for climate solutions and clean energy technologies by bringing together policymakers, businesses, and other stakeholders in support of ambitious climate policies and investments. Now, the evidence is clear more broadly that the United States can transition to a low carbon economy while creating great opportunities for businesses and positioning the economy for growth. To do that, we'll need a range of policies and investments, including comprehensive tax incentives for clean energy, support for electric vehicles, investment in clean energy manufacturing supply chains, and more. And many of those provisions were included in last year's Build Back Better Act. We also need to invest in communities, especially those marginalized in the past and those that are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change that we're already seeing. That means both increasing their resilience to climate impacts and also ensuring that those communities share in the benefits of the transition to a low carbon economy. I mentioned Build Back Better a minute ago, and I know there's uncertainty on where that stands at the moment, but I'm also hoping to pull on that thread a little bit more as we speak with the Secretary today. Because the truth is we can't afford not to move ahead with the clean energy tax credits and the strong climate and energy provisions that were included in that framework. The good news is that those provisions, which would represent the single largest investment in our nation's low carbon future, do have strong support in Congress and with voters in the polls. And notably, we're seeing maybe signs that Senator Manchin has reopened the door on the Senate's consideration of some package. The business case, meanwhile, for climate action has never been stronger. That's why 27 companies signed on to a C2ES letter last month urging congressional leadership to overcome the present impasse and act so that those historic climate investments are made. So now to today's program, we're particularly pleased, as I said, to have Secretary Granholm with us today to share her perspective on how innovative clean energy investments and policies can help the United States lead the global transition to a net zero economy. As I mentioned, Secretary Granholm leads the U.S. Department of Energy, and she leads it in helping America and President Biden achieve the goal of net zero carbon emissions by 2050 and a rapid reduction in carbon emissions by 2030 by advancing clean energy technologies, creating clean energy jobs, and building an equitable clean energy future. Prior to heading the Department of Energy, Secretary Granholm was the first woman elected governor of Michigan, serving from 2003 to 2011. Secretary Granholm, thanks so much for joining us and welcome.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nat. I really am grateful for the opportunity you guys are doing. C2ES is doing great work. And we appreciate the efforts to make business's voice known in this conversation because you have great weight.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate that. So let me dive in and let me start with last year's Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which was enacted, as we all know, better known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. So meeting that 2030 target I mentioned of cutting US emissions 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030, that's going to require transforming our economy and accelerating innovation. The infrastructure law we think of as providing a really crucial down payment on that transformation. And I'm interested in, I know that the department is doing a lot in terms of implementing those provisions. What are the climate and clean energy provisions that you are most focused on in driving down emissions over the coming decade?
Yeah, thanks for asking this question. It's a big down payment because for us in the Department of Energy, it is the biggest chunk of funding for the Department of Energy in our history in terms of add-on, and that's $62 billion, all focused on our goal of a clean energy future. So what the law actually does is it creates, not to talk about bureaucracy, but it creates actually 60 new programs inside of the Department of Energy and expands 12 additional programs, but they're all effectively targeted. So, it's foundational. So for example, $16 billion to upgrade and expand the grid, which we all know is critical if we're going to add all of these gigawatts of renewable energy on the grid. And if we're going to be adding, of course, electric vehicles to be charged on that grid. It adds the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, $7 billion for the battery supply chain for electric vehicles. It's got over $21 billion for demonstration projects in variety of things, but so $8 billion for clean hydrogen hubs around the country, $10 billion for demonstration projects on carbon capture and direct air capture and industrial decarbonization. It's got expanded loan authority through our loan programs office, Jigar Shah, some of you know, and that expanded authority goes to the issue of critical minerals and medium and heavy duty transportation. And we are hiring over 1,000 new staff to get it all done through this Clean Energy Corps, new Clean Energy Corps, which we have been advertising and are getting a lot of great response to. We're mobilizing a lot of these funds, and the funds get mobilized through requests for information or for notices of intent, where we're asking for feedback from the business community, from those who are active, from states, localities, et cetera, about how we're shaping things. So for example, those hydrogen hubs, we sent out a request for information. We got a lot of feedback in return. We're doing the same thing. We had a notice of intent out about the grid, for example, how we are going to be expanding it. What should we be taking on? So that's the precursor to actually putting out competitive grants for those subject areas. So that will all be happening over the next few months. You can get the latest if you're interested on this. You can get the latest at energy.gov/BIL for Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And we're excited about especially how those grants will be used to further climate and jobs and justice. So send us your best ideas.
Well, thanks so much. And that's a great overview of how massive those investments are, right? We look ahead, what else is needed? We'll get to that in a minute in the conversation, but I don't want to overlook the incredible investments that are being made, and really helpful to hear you lay out how you're thinking about implementing those and the care you're taking, while also doing that, as quickly as possible. So you mentioned jobs and justice. I actually want to pick up on a couple of those themes. First, on the jobs piece, there's so much talk, of course, about American competitiveness and the global economy. We all like to talk about that. I think that's critical as we think about how to move forward with these investments. And that's what we hear a lot from the companies we work with at C2ES, the way that investments in low carbon infrastructure and innovation will be really critical to their competitiveness. Can you say a little bit more about that connection? What are some of the specific ways you see some of these investments, maybe under the bipartisan law, that are really going to boost American competitiveness, both for companies and for workers?
Yeah, there's so much going on in the competitiveness space. But first, just sort of as an overview, the number that I use all the time, which studies have shown to be the case, that by the end of this decade, this global market for clean technologies is going to be worth $23 trillion globally. And so the president wants America and American companies to corner that market. And so we're going to do that by obviously investing in clean energy and building up our domestic supply chains for EVs and batteries and offshore wind and more, and creating millions of good paying jobs across the nation, right? So The bipartisan infrastructure law combined, if we're going to able to get the second step, right? You referred to the second bite at the apple, which is the tax credits. That would create about, that combination, that 1-2 step would create about 1.5 million jobs a year over the course of the decade. And, you know, the supply chain piece is a big part of that. The president has really put an emphasis, for example, on battery manufacturing and workforce development. We know that China controls most of the battery supply chain right now, but we should work to secure reliable sources, either from home or from our allies abroad, to be able to supply the lithium, the cobalt, the minerals that will be going into batteries, as well as, of course, the semiconductors, which is all part of the America Competes Act, I think is what the latest version of it is called. But the bottom line is that's being negotiated right now in terms of semiconductors, the CHIPS Act in Congress, and we're really hopeful about that. But the bottom line is domestic capacity to build clean energy is going to help us to, to be energy secure, to be clean energy independent. Obviously, it would boost our competitiveness with other countries as well. And it's therefore, we just have not as a nation had a strategy for securing the supply chains, for actually doing domestic manufacturing like we do under this president. And so that's what's really exciting. We know that other countries have got state-owned enterprises, and that's how they become competitive, and they've got cheap labor and all that. We don't have that. We don't do it that way in America. But what we do have is public-private partnerships to make American businesses competitive through, in this case, robust tax incentives that help to bring down the cost and make them competitive and get that whole supply chain here, so we're not relying upon other countries that don't have our interests at heart.
Yeah, there's so much in there I want to unpack and come back to, in particular, the how America stays competitive and the role of innovation. We'll come back to that, but that the role of that secure supply chain, I think, is really clear, and something we'll talk about Ukraine in a minute. I think we've all become much more aware about the importance of that. But I want to pull on this piece that you just mentioned, and that I had mentioned as well, about the other shoe to drop, as it were, the other part of the broader agenda. Every analysis I've seen, says that the climate and energy provisions that were in that Build Back Better framework, along with what's already been enacted in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, that those are really critical to meeting that 2030 target. And as I mentioned, they're also broadly popular with voters and with Americans. And so I know you can't speak to the congressional, the ins and outs of Congress, but can you speak to how the administration, the president, and you view the necessity of that other piece of the policy agenda as a complement, maybe, to some of the other regulatory actions and other things that the president and that other parts of the government can do, and how critical are they to meeting that 2030 goal?
There is no doubt it's essential. I mean, we actually put the 35 goal, which is 100% clean electricity by 2035. We have got to accelerate. And the only way you can accelerate at the level we need is by getting everybody in the game. And the only way you get everybody in the game is if you offer incentives to get them in the game, which is why those tax incentives are so critical. Tax incentives both for the generation, but also for the manufacturing in the United States. And I personally really like the tech neutral, incentivizing. I know there are versions that are technology specific, but if we're getting zero carbon emitting technology in the ground, let's go. Let's incentivize that. So bottom line, it's a hugely important question. We got another reminder of this from the IPCC this week that time's running out to avoid the worst. And this administration definitely understands that that climate science is demanding urgency from us. So we're really proud of the infrastructure law because it lays a foundation. As you said, it was a down payment, but it's not by itself. It's just not enough. It is not enough. It's why we absolutely need the rest of the agenda, which is going to get this country on the path to meeting the climate goals. The fight's not over, though. Nat, I really am not giving up hope on this Congress. I will say this: it's not just up to Congress, right? The administration isn't wasting a day to advance other action through the executive branch, EPA's work on regulating pollutants, the SEC's climate risk findings, by the end of 2022, we expect to finalize more than, for example, 100 proposed and final actions for appliance and equipment standards. We can do that. We know that there is an all hands on deck effort, but we also know that those tax credits are just so critical to being able to really accelerate at the level that we need, at the emergency level that we need, because it is code red on humanity right now.
No, thanks for that. And as I said, I mentioned briefly in the outset, we hear the same thing from the companies we work with very clearly. Many of whom I know are listening in and on the call. That the importance of the policy framework and the investment framework that the government can provide to really accelerate the deployment of those technologies. And you mentioned the IPCC report, really timely, of course, and such a clear message that the cost of those renewable technologies are falling so fast everywhere. And now it's just a matter of accelerating that deployment. And that's where I think, another message from that IPCC report is that policies work to do that when you put them in place. We've seen them work. And so we just need to do that, here as well and continue to push on that. Let me shift gears a little bit, because I do want to acknowledge, this is a huge transformation we're talking about, right? This is an enormous transformation. And we talk about the benefits and the opportunities and the boost in competitiveness, and all that is real. But this is also, huge transformation of the economy. What are the challenges you see to that? I mean, some of the ones when I look at it, how do we ensure that we're really being fair to communities that have been dependent on fossil fuels in the past and helping them through the transition? And how do we also make sure that the benefits of this transition are really widely shared, including among marginalized and low-income communities? So how do you think about some of those challenges and maybe turning those into opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, I so appreciate you raising this issue, making sure that every community finds their place in this clean energy economy it's a huge challenge, but it is a massive opportunity. I mean, DOE has, we've brought on this very intentional, increased focus on place-based work, because we know that so many of the solutions that we need are born at the community level. And we also want to make sure that we are not leaving communities behind. In fact, communities have been left behind, and communities that have been at the back of the line should be at the front of the line in terms of economic opportunity and climate. So we recently announced, I was just talking about this with some press this morning, 22 communities that are going to receive technical assistance from DOE to meet their climate and clean energy goals. It's called Communities Leap. And a lot of the communities that we're talking about are communities that may not, that are underserved. And so navigating the federal bureaucracy to begin with, it requires a level of skill that almost no community has, but certainly communities that need help in accessing federal funds. So we've adopted these 22 communities because we put out a request for funding opportunity announcement, and we got all these applications, and we picked 22 of them that have the best plans for what they would do with DOE technical assistance, but really focusing on that place-based strategy is critical. We did the same thing with communities that were fossil and power plant communities that feel like they have been left behind, that they have powered this nation for the past 100 years. We want them to see themselves as powering the nation for the next 100 years, but in clean energy. And so many of the skills matched work that our fossil communities are using could be also done by clean energy technologies. So to me, the different needs of those different kinds of communities are critical, and we have a total focus on this. You know that the president, of course, has this Justice 40 initiative where 40% of the funding has got to go to communities that are in those categories that may have been left behind. So for us, it's like a mission. It's a real way to have tangible benefit in communities across the country. And I'd say one of the other huge challenges that is out there is the barriers to deployment that drive me absolutely nuts, which is things like the length of time to get a permit for, the electric grid. We know that permitting was instituted for good reasons and for, really valid ways of improving and bettering the environment. Sometimes though, over time, these permits can can defeat the purpose entirely. The fact that it takes 5 years to get a permit on public land for a geothermal plant, for example, especially if you're not, infringing upon tribal rights, et cetera, it's just insane. So some of those challenges we're working on internally as well. This is true with like permitting offshore wind and all of that. So we've got work groups inside of the federal government saying, how can we be more efficient? How can we complement permitting? If there's 2 permits required, can we do them, can we pancake them? Are there things that both are looking at that are the same, that we don't have to have people do twice? All of that kind of stuff are part of the challenge and part of the opportunity in this clean energy deployment.
Yeah, I'm really appreciate you highlighting that, Secretary Granholm, because that again is something we hear from our companies. And that's something I remember seeing when I was in the Obama administration 10 years ago. I helped work on some of the infrastructure permitting acceleration, and some of that got into the FAST Act, and some of that is I know that the Biden administration is implementing that. We've had the chance to talk to Christine Harada at FIPSI,
yeah.
Really looking to accelerate that. And I know there's so much more work to be done, and that's something we're very, very keen to help with, because there is this huge opportunity agenda to building the clean energy infrastructure that creates jobs and reduces emissions and all those things. But as you say, we've got to push through and figure out how to streamline some of those processes.
We're working on that. That to me, that's
I'm glad to hear it. I'm going to ask one more of my questions, and then I have a couple from the audience. And I know we're already, we're zooming through our time, but I do want to shift gears. We've been looking really closely at the U.S. and the United States context, of course. But as we all know, and I know you're thinking about this every day and leading some of the administration's thinking on this, we're also in the context in the energy world of the war on Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine that has upended the energy sector. We hear lots of talk about the need for increasing U.S. oil and gas production to try to wean Europe off of Russian oil, and I understand the security implications of that in the short term and the need to help them cut their dependence. How do we do that while in the long run making sure we also support Europe and elsewhere in accelerating the transition to the low carbon and net zero economy, so that we're not building it? How do we balance those immediate security concerns with the long-term climate crisis?
Yeah, this is such an important issue. First of all, thanks for acknowledging. We all know, we can see with our own eyes what's happening on TV. We know we have got to get our allies off of Russian oil and gas. They should not be under the thumb of Putin any more than we or anybody else should. And the best way, of course, in the medium and long term is to be clean energy independent, right? Is to move to accelerate the transition. So because no country has ever been held hostage to access to the sun. No country has ever been held hostage to being able to access wind. Honestly, my counterpart in Ireland, his name is Minister Ryan, Eamon Ryan, he was saying, which I thought was a beautiful phrase, that if we accelerate this movement to clean energy, it could be the greatest peace plan that the world has ever seen. Because of course, we all have access to this form of energy. So we're not there yet in terms of deploying. And so what do we do in that transition? And how do we make sure that we are not making investments that can't be undone? How do we make sure that we're helping our allies? So yes, we're increasing supply. We've asked oil and gas companies, they've got all these permits. Please just turn on the rigs that you've already got. Open up the wells that you've already drilled. You've got 9,000 permits that you have that are unused right now that are already permitted. Please help us. So what a number of them, not all of them, but a number of them have done is that they will increase production to the tune of about 1 million barrels per year. We have to get to 3 million. At least 3 million will have been pulled off of the global oil supply by what is happening by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the step back of using any Russian oil. So that 3 million, we are going to supply 1 million of, but until we can get to that point, because you can't turn rigs on and wells on a dime, the president has called for the release of the strategic petroleum reserve amount, 1 million barrels per day for the next 6 months until we get there. In the meantime, we also have the opportunity to move to efficiency. And this is why the president also issued, when he announced that Strategic Petroleum Reserve release, he said, I'm also going to invoke the Defense Production Act to be able to get the critical minerals in the United States that we need to be able to produce the batteries for electric vehicles, which will allow us to transition so that we don't ever have to worry about this again. So I think both steps are very clear. Both steps, we have to talk about both steps in the supply side, but the demand side as well, and transitioning to this clean energy future, which will make us much more energy secure and nationally secure as well.
I really appreciate the way you lay that out, Secretary Granholm, and I don't want to be naive, but I'm hopeful that maybe the mix of things you just laid out could provide some political space to have both the acknowledgement of what we need to do right away to help our allies in Europe, but also accelerating that transition to clean energy, as you said. So we've got about 4 minutes left. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions that arise from the audience briefly. One of them just picks up on exactly what you said. So it's a nice segue. Could you say just a little bit more? You mentioned the Defense Production Act and the immediate term focus on those critical minerals. How more broadly is the administration thinking about sourcing those critical minerals, which are, as you said, so key for battery production and for other renewables?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, we have another issue on this, is we have to be able to sustainably extract critical minerals inside of and mining has not been the most environmentally friendly occupation, right? It's not been the most environmentally friendly business. So we've got a mining act that's over 100 years old that doesn't have any environmental standards. We need to upgrade our own system to be able to responsibly extract and do it in partnership with communities. So I use as an example what is happening in the Salton Sea in California. They've got this massive potential for lithium extraction using geothermal brines in a very sustainable process. That's super exciting. There are other places that are looking at sustainable extraction like that, but that's a piece of it. We also can partner with allies. Canada has an awful lot of critical minerals, but you got the critical minerals and then you have to separate them and you have to process them. That kind of work is all done in China. And so do we have an opportunity now to do some responsible separation and processing in the United States and create jobs to have that full supply chain here? Yes. And that's really what the president is invoking the Defense Production Act to do. And it's part of what the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law is funding as well. So yes, on critical minerals and on the rest of the supply chains. I mean, you've got silicon that we need for solar panels. We have to bring back the production of solar panels in the United States. We have to make sure that we've got the full supply chain for the racks, the trackers, which means steel that is sustainably manufactured in the United States. And if we do this right in a sustainable way, that means our products, our critical minerals, our steel, our whatever, is more attractive to other countries that are also looking to procure sustainable means to produce clean energy. So I think it's a market opportunity in addition to an opportunity for us to create jobs and for us to create energy security.
Thank you for that. So that was terrific and really comprehensive and great answer and really informative. So let me close by asking you one quick question because we're almost at time. We haven't talked, I would have loved to talk more about innovation and science. We just so much with it to talk about, but of course that's a core part of DOE. And it's also a place where I find some optimism. And so my question is, as you look across the array of new technologies on the horizon, new low carbon climate technologies, what's one that really gives you a lot of hope for the future?
Honestly, I mean, I love so many. We have all these Earth shots, which is a shot to reduce the cost of clean hydrogen, a shot to reduce, this is like the sun shot under the Obama administration. We're doing the same thing to reduce the cost of long duration storage, of direct air capture, etc. But honestly, I think one of the most underused opportunities that we have in the United States is enhanced geothermal systems. It's the dispatchable clean baseload power that's beneath our feet. And we have not done what we can, I think, to extract it. And I think it's one of the many, as you say, there's a whole suite of things that we could be doing. I call it the silver, not the silver bullet, but the silver buckshot, because we want all of them. But I love geothermal personally as an opportunity.
Well, Secretary Granholm, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and with your insights. It's really been terrific to talk with you. We could probably go on for another half hour, but I know you've carved this time out from your schedule. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your leadership and the administration's leadership on these issues and for navigating these really tough issues in in challenging times, but really appreciate your joining us, but much more your service. So thank you so much, and really appreciate your joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks so much for all you do too. Thanks, everybody listening. All right.
And thanks everybody to the audience. Take care, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.